In this video, I'm going to go over how I LS3 swapped my LS1 Camaro. My goal is to capture all the things I had to do to make this swap work for my car, so that if you're considering doing a swap like this yourself, you have a pretty good idea of the problems you'll have to deal with. Just like with my previous videos, I'm going to have this one split up into sections, which should show up on the progress bar at the bottom of the video, so if you want to skip through the introduction part I do, or have a specific section you're interested in, feel free to skip ahead to those. To start, let's talk about how I even got here. Those of you who have seen my previous videos will know I have a 1999 Camaro SS that's been my drift car for the past few years. For the majority of that time, it had a almost completely stock LS1 that was treating me pretty well. The only thing really done to that was oil pan baffles and a Volvo electric power steering pump, and it was pretty resilient considering what I was putting it through. But about a year and a half ago, I started hearing some valve train noise, and when we took a look in there, we saw some wear on the camshaft, so we decided to go ahead and do a cam swap. When that was all finished, I went straight into doing drift events with the car again, and after 1.5 drift events, the car started misfiring pretty bad. So we decided to pack it up and take it back home. We took the engine out and tore it apart to see what happened. What we found was that one of the valves had actually snapped into 2 pieces right where the valve keepers go. At this point, I was hoping that the bottom end would be pretty okay, but unfortunately, when we took the heads off, we saw that there was some damage to one of the cylinder bores. When I first saw it, it didn't look too bad to me, so I thought we could just bore over the engine a little bit, but when I looked into this, I realized that that's probably not a good move on these LS1s. This meant that the only real option for saving this block was going to be to have it sleeved, but from the little bit of research I did, I saw that with the Gen 3 blocks, you have to do a wet sleeve, so definitely not worth it to me to spend a bunch of money fixing up this LS1 when there's other, maybe more exciting options out there. One last thing to mention is that while this isn't a strict, cheap budget build by any means, I did try and reuse as much as I could from the LS1 to help keep my spending from getting way out of control. So there's some things I did, like reusing the camshaft I had from the LS1, where if I was looking to get everything I could out of the new engine build, I would probably want to do something else, but for the sake of not spending a ton more money than I had to, I went ahead and made do with what I could reuse. You should be able to reuse basically all of the connectors and sensors from the LS1 in the Gen 4 block, but some of them do change locations. So these first 2 here that are listed, for example, the map sensor and the cam angle sensor, both lived at the back of the engine on the LS1 and were moved to the front of the engine for the LS3, with the cam angle sensor being in the front cover now and the map sensor being right next to where the throttle body is. So what this means is that you will have to extend the wiring for your connectors for those sensors. There are 2 ways to go about this. One is that a lot of companies sell extension harnesses specifically for doing a swap like this. The other option is to disassemble your wire harness a little bit and cut and splice in those extensions yourself. This is the route I decided to go with it. For the map sensor specifically, one thing you might run into is the hole it goes into now on the intake for the LS3 intake is a bit too big for the sensor itself. Some people will, I think, double up on kind of the little rubber gasket that's in there. In my case, Ashlyn went ahead and machined a spacer for it, which is pressed in there to fill that gap, and you might have to fabricate a little clip on top to kind of hold it in the way it was originally. For the cam angle sensor, it's now part of the front cover on the Gen 4 engines, and I actually went ahead and bought a front cover that came with a new sensor and everything already installed. It also came with this little bracket. The routing was a little bit nicer when I unplugged that part and just went straight to the sensor. One of the reasons for this is that I don't have the power steering pump there anymore because I have the Volvo electric one. That might look a little bit different if you do still have the stock power steering. One of the other bigger changes going from the Gen 3 to the Gen 4 is where the knock sensors are. In the Gen 3 engines, they actually are located in the valley cover, whereas on the Gen 4, they're moved to the sides of the block. From what I've seen, no one's really figured out how to use the Gen 4 knock sensors with the LS1 Camaro ECU, so it's usually recommended to stick with the original knock sensors that came with the cars and to just move them to the side of the block. The process for moving the knock sensors is pretty straightforward. You just have to drill out one of the threaded holes on the side of the block a little bit and re-tap it. One thing that remains to be seen with this is if we have to adjust the sensitivity of the knock sensors and HP tuners when we go to tune the car, because since we moved them, there is a chance that they won't read quite the same in the side of the block as they did at the top where they were originally, but I'll update on that in a future video if that is a problem. We actually had issues fitting the connector that goes on the knock sensor with the headers that we have on the driver's side of the car. To deal with this, we soldered the wire for the knock sensor right onto the sensor itself and then filled the hole with epoxy, which means we don't have that big connector sticking out anymore and hitting our header. And then I went ahead and added a new connector in later down the wire so that you could still remove the knock sensor without having to cut the harness. Something we actually noticed with the cam swap we did previously is that the intake air temperature sensor with where it's located for the LS1 Camaros tends to get heat soaked when the car is sitting idling, especially after doing a couple laps of drifting or something like that. So our plan is to relocate the intake air temperature sensor somewhere where it's not going to have that issue, and hopefully that'll help the car run a little better. You may also have to consider the mass airflow sensor if you decide to do a different intake for the car. We were able to squeeze the stock intake over the bigger throttle body we now have on the car for now, but this is hopefully just going to be a temporary setup to get the car up and running until we do a different intake that's not going to be as restrictive. So if you get rid of that stock intake completely, you need to figure something out with the mass airflow sensor that's part of that whole system. So you could either switch to just running speed density, in which case you don't need it, or include the stock mass airflow sensor somewhere in your new intake, or even switch to a different style of sensor that's not going to be as small and restrictive as the stock one might be. So both these last two items are not absolutely necessary for an LS3 swap in one of these cars, but probably things you want to at least have on your radar and consider for your project. Moving on to engine internals you need to be aware of for the swap. The first and one of the more critical parts of doing the swap is dealing with the different reluctor wheel tooth count between what comes in the LS3 and what the LS1 ECU is expecting. The LS3 comes with a reluctor wheel that has 58 teeth on it, and the LS1 came with one that only has 24 teeth. So if you buy a junkyard LS3 and just shove it into your car, the ECU is not going to be able to read the results of the crankshaft position sensor correctly. There's a couple different strategies to deal with this depending on how you go about your project. And let's say you don't want to open up the engine at all. In that case, you need to do something between the engine and the ECU to convert the signal to be usable by your LS1 ECU. The only real option I've seen for this is a box Lingenfelter makes that does this conversion for you. If you are going to tear your engine apart, you have more options available to you. If you're getting an aftermarket crankshaft, a lot of the times you can specify what tooth count reluctor wheel you want already pressed on it. You could also take the crankshaft that was in the LS3, if it came with one, and take it to a machine shop and have them press on the different reluctor wheel for you. However, what I was able to do is the crankshaft in the LS1 I had before was still in good condition, so I was actually able to have that checked out by machine shop and polished up a little bit, and then I just put that in the LS3 that I had. So that I already had the reluctor wheel that's correct for the LS1 because it came out of my LS1 and I didn't have to worry about it. The other part you need to be aware of as far as engine internals go is the cam sprocket and making sure you have the right one for your application. For these sprockets, you need to take a look at the bolt pattern. They come in both 3-bolt and 1-bolt varieties. The 3-bolt coming from the earlier LS1s, LS6s, and the 1-bolts coming from the later Gen 4 engines. So here you need to know what camshaft you're going to be using. In my example, I am actually reusing the camshaft out of that LS1 I had before because it's in pretty good shape still, and that one accepts a 3-bolt sprocket. Then you also need to look at the sensor trigger setup on the sprocket itself. That's going to be the protruding bar on the sprocket. Our LS1 ECU is going to expect a single segment setup for this, so only one bar, whereas the later ECUs would expect to see multiple bars. While you're in that area, it's probably worth picking up a LS3 specific chain damper to help keep the chain from moving around too much. So with the wiring and the engine internals out of the way, now we're on to kind of the last miscellaneous category of things to think about when doing this swap. One is going to be that you can't reuse the LS1 intake manifold, so that does mean you have to buy a new intake manifold. I went ahead and got a stock LS3 intake manifold off Rock Auto. It wasn't the cheapest thing in the world, but at least it is a pretty good upgrade over the LS1 intake manifold as far as airflow goes. Something else that you'll need to account for is fuel rails and injectors for this engine. Just like with the intake manifold, the LS1 fuel rails are not going to fit on your LS3. I got radium fuel rails. Then you'll probably need some injectors that offer more flow than the stock LS1 injectors did. The easiest option for this would just be to buy some new injectors that are compatible with your LS3. In my case, I already had bigger injectors that I got for my LS1 previously for the cam swap, so if possible, I wanted to reuse those. However, you do want to be aware that if you're going to try and use aftermarket LS1 specific injectors for your LS3, there's a couple things you're going to have to change. One is getting specific O-rings for them to fit fit correctly into the LS3 intake manifold. But one issue we ran into, specifically using the radium fuel rails, is those were designed to be used on an LS1 or an LS3, but when you mix LS1 injectors, what the height those are, with everything else being LS3, the heights get a little mismatched. So Ashlyn actually had to go ahead and machine some little spacers for me so that the longer LS1 style injectors would fit. Continuing with our fuel discussion, another thing that you'll need is probably a larger fuel pump. These cars are a little bit tricky in terms of upgrading fuel pumps because of the way the Venturi system and the bucket in the fuel tank are. So you run into this issue of if you want to fit the bigger fuel pump in the stock location, you probably have to modify or get rid of some of those systems, which is worrying in terms of running the car with less than half a tank of gas, because those systems are there to help make sure that the pump can always grab gas so it can't slosh away from the pickup. There are a couple solutions out there that are meant to avoid running into these issues. In my case, we went ahead and just splurged for a surge tank. That way I could put a bigger pump in the surge tank while keeping the stock pump in the original fuel tank as just a lift pump going into the surge tank. We still ended up modifying the bucket in the Venturi system a bit just to make the return work. Another thing you'll probably have to change is the throttle body for your LS3. The thing to keep in mind here is, one, the LS1 throttle body is too small for the LS3 intake manifold, so you're not going to be able to reuse that most likely without creating a massive restriction. And then also the LS3s were drive-by-wire, whereas the LS1 Camaros have a cable-operated throttle. In my case, I just actually got a used aftermarket throttle body off Facebook Marketplace, and we got this kit to be able to use the cable setup in my car to operate the throttle. With the bigger throttle body, you need to make sure your intake is going to work, or get something else if you want less restriction there. Another thing that's not going to transfer from your LS1 to the LS3 is the steam port vent tubes. Those are a different shape for the LS3. So in my case, what I did is I bought a OEM replacement front steam port vent tube for an LS3 engine and just deleted the back ones. And the last two things you want to make sure you have are a LS3 valley cover. The LS1 had the knock sensors in the valley cover, and then the LS3 does not. I just got a cheap Summit brand one. And then finally, you'll need a different style front cover because it will now have the cam angle sensor. With that, you should hopefully know everything you need to swap an LS3 into your LS1 Camaro or Firebird and have it function with your LS1 ECU. While we haven't actually tuned and driven the car yet, we did go ahead and start it up to make sure the engine is healthy and to prove to ourselves that all these things I just described do actually work. So here's a clip of our first start with the engine and it running briefly. A little while after that, we got the cooling system all hooked up and let it idle all the way up to operating temperature. So here's another clip of that. Well, I think I hit all the points you need to swap an LS3 into your car and have it run. What I didn't talk very much about was the performance modifications I did to this engine. This car is a drift car after all, and I'm actually hoping to rev it out a decent bit to 7,500 RPM is the goal. So I did a decent bit of work on top of just the bare minimum for the swap to hopefully have that work reliably in a drift application. So my plan is to make a follow-up video to go over all those more performance-specific modifications I did during this engine build. So stay tuned for that if you're interested. But for now, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in a future video.